April 15, 1931. Coney Island, New York. Inside a restaurant known as Nuova Villa Tomorrow, one of the most powerful crime bosses in America sat down to eat lunch. His name was Giuseppe Masuria, known throughout the underworld as Joe the Boss Masuria. By the end of that afternoon, he would be dead. Police reports, newspaper accounts, and later organized crime investigations would identify the killing as one of the defining moments in American Mafia history. It was not simply the murder of a crime boss. According to multiple documented accounts, it marked the collapse of an old system and the birth of a new one. At the center of that transformation stood a man named Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897 before immigrating with his family to New York City as a child. Historical records place the family on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood crowded with immigrants, poverty, street gangs, and opportunity for those willing to operate outside the law. During his youth, Luciano became involved with neighborhood delinquent groups and gradually developed connections that would shape the future of organized crime in America. Law enforcement histories and organized crime researchers have often noted that Luciano emerged during a period when traditional criminal organizations were undergoing dramatic change. The old Sicilian-style mafia structure in New York emphasized loyalty to regional origins and rigid traditions. At the same time, younger criminals were building partnerships across ethnic and organizational lines. Luciano belonged firmly to that younger generation. Among the men he associated with were individuals who would later become some of the most influential figures in American organized crime. Documented accounts place him alongside men such as Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. These relationships reflected a practical approach to criminal enterprise. Rather than limiting cooperation to a narrow circle, Luciano increasingly worked with people who could help generate profits regardless of their background. The timing of his rise was significant. In 1920, the United States entered the era of Prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol created one of the largest black markets in American history. Federal authorities struggled to enforce the law, while criminal organizations discovered unprecedented opportunities for wealth. Smuggling networks expanded. Corruption spread through political institutions. Violence escalated as rival groups competed for territory and control. By the mid-1920s, organized crime in New York was generating enormous profits through illegal liquor operations. Yet success brought conflict. The more money available, the more fiercely gangs fought to control it. Traditional mafia leaders, often referred to by historians as the Mustache Petes, favored older customs and hierarchical authority. Younger figures, such as Luciano, viewed those traditions as obstacles to expansion. According to organized crime historians, this generational divide became one of the defining pressures inside the underworld. Luciano initially operated under Joe Masuria, who had become one of the dominant mafia bosses in New York. Masuria controlled a powerful criminal organization and sought to consolidate authority over rival groups. Federal investigations conducted years later, combined with historical research, describe him as a central figure in what would become known as the Castellammarese War. The conflict was not a single battle. It was a prolonged and deadly struggle for control of organized crime in New York. Opposing Masuria was Salvatore Maranzano, another Sicilian-born mafia leader whose supporters included many immigrants from Castellamare del Golfo. By 1930, violence between the factions had intensified dramatically. Assassinations, ambushes, and shifting alliances became routine features of the criminal landscape. For men caught between the two camps, survival became increasingly difficult. Luciano occupied one of the most dangerous positions imaginable. Publicly aligned with Masuria, he also maintained relationships with individuals who saw the future differently. Historians have long debated the precise timeline of his decision-making during this period, but documented accounts consistently portray him as a figure frustrated by endless warfare. The conflict was damaging business. Profits were being lost. Associates were being killed. Police attention was increasing. From the perspective of younger gang leaders, the war threatened the very criminal empire they hoped to build. One incident highlighted the danger surrounding Luciano himself. In 1929, he was abducted, beaten, and left for dead. Contemporary reports documented severe injuries, including damage to his face. Although the exact perpetrators were never definitively established, many historians have connected the attack to tensions within organized crime circles. Luciano survived, but the experience reinforced a reality that everyone in the underworld already understood. Power could disappear overnight. As the Castellammarese War continued, casualties mounted. Key figures from both factions were targeted. Gunmen operated across New York streets with increasing frequency. Newspapers covered gangland murders in sensational detail. Public concern grew while authorities struggled to penetrate the secrecy surrounding Mafia operations. Yet beneath the violence, something larger was taking shape. Researchers examining Luciano's later actions frequently point to his apparent preference for centralized management rather than constant warfare. Rather than pursuing domination through endless bloodshed, he seemed increasingly interested in creating a stable structure capable of maximizing profits and reducing internal conflict. That vision was fundamentally different from the old model. The traditional system revolved around powerful bosses demanding absolute obedience. Luciano and several of his closest associates appeared to favor a more organized arrangement in which disputes could be managed without constant war. The obstacle standing in the way of that future was obvious. Joe Masuria remained one of the most powerful men in American organized crime. As long as he controlled his faction, meaningful change would be extraordinarily difficult. Throughout early 1931, the balance of power continued to shift. Murders weakened both sides. Loyalties became uncertain. Secret negotiations reportedly occurred among influential figures seeking an end to the conflict. What appeared on the surface to be a war between rival bosses increasingly resembled a struggle over the future direction of organized crime itself. Then came April. Masuria agreed to meet Luciano for lunch in Coney Island. The gathering did not initially appear unusual. Powerful criminals frequently conducted business over meals. Witness accounts later described cards being played. Food was served. Conversation continued. But beneath the routine atmosphere, events were moving toward a decisive turning point. Years later, investigators, journalists, and organized crime scholars would scrutinize every known detail surrounding that meeting. They would examine who attended, who left, and who survived. Because according to the historical record, a moment was approaching that would alter the structure of the American Mafia for decades. And as Luciano sat across from Joe Masuria that afternoon, the future of organized crime hung on what happened next. As Luciano sat across from Joe Masuria that afternoon, the future of organized crime hung on what happened next. Shortly before the shooting, according to multiple documented accounts, Luciano excused himself from the table. Reports differ on the precise reason given, but investigators and historians generally agree on one critical fact. When the gunman entered the restaurant, Luciano was no longer seated beside Masuria. Seconds later, gunfire erupted. Joe Masuria was struck multiple times and killed inside the restaurant. Police photographs and contemporary newspaper coverage documented the aftermath. A playing card was reportedly found near the scene, an image that would become one of the most recognizable crime photographs of the era. The murder immediately became front-page news across New York. The identity of the shooters has remained a subject of historical debate for decades. Law enforcement never secured convictions for the killing. However, numerous organized crime historians have cited later testimony, intelligence reports, and underworld accounts suggesting that several future Mafia leaders may have participated in the attack. What remains beyond dispute is the outcome. Joe Masuria was dead. The Castellammarese War had reached its decisive turning point. For years, Masuria had represented one side of a conflict that consumed New York's criminal world. His removal instantly altered the balance of power. Salvatore Maranzano emerged as the apparent victor, and for a brief period, he appeared positioned to become the undisputed leader of the American Mafia. Yet the deeper significance of the murder extended far beyond a single boss. According to many organized crime scholars, Luciano's actions reflected a growing belief that perpetual internal warfare threatened the profitability and survival of criminal organizations. The old system rewarded personal dominance. The newer generation increasingly focused on efficiency, cooperation, and expansion. The killing of Mafia removed one obstacle. Another remained. In the months following the assassination, Maranzano consolidated authority. Historical records indicate that he reorganized New York's mafia groups into what eventually became known as the Five Families. He also reportedly declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses. To traditional mafia leaders, the title carried prestige. To Luciano and many younger figures, it represented a return to the very structure they hoped to eliminate. Maranzano's position created a familiar problem. Power concentrated in one individual inevitably created rivals. Federal investigators and later historians would conclude that tensions between Maranzano and Luciano developed rapidly. Although the exact details of every conversation remain unknown, multiple documented sources describe increasing distrust between the two men. The reasons were not difficult to understand. Luciano possessed influence. He had strong relationships across criminal organizations. He was connected to profitable enterprises. Most importantly, he represented a different vision of organized crime. Rather than enforcing absolute personal authority, Luciano appeared to favor a system in which major organizations could cooperate while maintaining independence. Maranzano reportedly saw danger in that approach. What happened next would become one of the most consequential power shifts in American underworld history. In September 1931, only months after Mafia's murder, Maranzano himself was killed inside his Manhattan office. According to widely accepted historical accounts, men posing as government agents gained access to the building before attacking him. As with the Mafia killing, numerous details remain disputed among researchers. Yet the outcome is firmly established in organized crime history. Salvatore Maranzano was dead. Within a matter of months, both leaders of the Castellammarese War had been eliminated. The old guard had effectively collapsed. The violence shocked even hardened criminals. Two of the most powerful mafia bosses in America had fallen in rapid succession. Their deaths demonstrated a reality that law enforcement officials and criminal participants alike understood well. Leadership in organized crime was never secure. But the truth was far darker. The murders were not simply about removing individuals. They reflected a larger transformation occurring throughout organized crime. Traditional hierarchies had failed to prevent bloodshed. Old loyalties had fractured. The pursuit of profit was increasingly outweighing regional identities and historic rivalries. Luciano stood at the center of this transition. Unlike previous bosses who sought personal supremacy, historical accounts suggest he focused on building structures capable of managing disputes before they erupted into war. Organized crime experts have frequently described this period as the moment when American organized crime evolved into a more coordinated national enterprise. One of the most significant developments attributed to Luciano was the creation of a governing body often referred to as the Commission. According to numerous mafia historians, the Commission functioned as a mechanism for resolving conflicts among powerful crime families. Rather than relying exclusively on violence, disputes could theoretically be addressed through collective decision-making. The arrangement did not eliminate murder. It did not end criminal activity. It did not create peace. What it created was stability, and stability generated profits. From the perspective of criminal leadership, that mattered enormously. Throughout the 1930s, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, extortion, and various other enterprises expanded significantly. Law enforcement agencies at the time often struggled to understand the full scope of the networks involved. Corruption complicated investigations. Witnesses feared retaliation. Criminal organizations operated through layers of insulation designed to protect senior leadership. Luciano became one of the most influential figures in this emerging structure. His authority rested not only on fear, but also on relationships. Historians examining the period have repeatedly emphasized his ability to build alliances among diverse criminal groups. This approach differed sharply from earlier mafia traditions. The underworld was becoming more corporate, more organized, more profitable. Yet, greater power inevitably attracted greater scrutiny. Local police departments continued pursuing gangsters, but their efforts often remained fragmented. Different jurisdictions worked independently. Intelligence sharing was limited. criminal organizations exploited these weaknesses. At the same time, public concern about organized crime continued growing. Newspaper investigations highlighted corruption. Political leaders faced increasing pressure. Federal authorities slowly expanded their interest in large-scale criminal enterprises. What no one knew at the time was that the next threat to Luciano would not emerge from a rival mafia faction. It would come from outside the underworld entirely. Unlike many gangland conflicts, the challenge ahead would involve prosecutors, witnesses, courtrooms, and public opinion. The criminal structure Luciano helped create had survived a devastating internal war. It had outlasted powerful bosses. It had reshaped organized crime across New York. But its most influential architect was about to face a danger that bullets could not solve. In 1935, New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey began building cases against major organized crime figures. Dewey's investigations would eventually target gambling operations, corruption networks, and criminal enterprises that authorities believed had operated with relative impunity for years. The confrontation between Luciano and law enforcement was approaching. And once prosecutors began pulling at the threads surrounding his empire, investigators would uncover evidence capable of threatening everything he had built. The confrontation between Luciano and law enforcement was approaching. And once prosecutors began pulling at the threads surrounding his empire, investigators would uncover evidence capable of threatening everything he had built. In the mid-1930s, Thomas E. Dewey was emerging as one of the most aggressive prosecutors in the United States. Unlike many earlier investigations that focused on individual crimes, Dewey's team sought to expose entire criminal enterprises. Organized crime figures had long relied on layers of intermediaries to shield themselves from direct involvement in illegal activity. Witnesses were intimidated. Records were scarce. Senior leaders rarely handled criminal transactions personally. Dewey aimed to break that pattern. His investigators focused on a large vice network operating throughout New York City. The case centered on prostitution rackets that authorities alleged were controlled through a structured system of managers, brothel operators, and criminal associates. Rather than targeting only lower-level participants, prosecutors attempted to identify those who allegedly benefited from the organization as a whole. According to court records, investigators spent months gathering evidence. Witness interviews expanded. Financial connections were examined. Law enforcement officials sought to demonstrate that Luciano occupied a supervisory position within the enterprise. The resulting prosecution became one of the most significant organized crime cases of the decade. In 1936, Luciano stood trial in New York. The proceedings attracted enormous public attention. Newspapers covered developments extensively. The defendant was no ordinary criminal suspect. He was widely regarded as one of the most influential underworld figures in America. Prosecutors presented testimony from numerous witnesses. Their argument was that Luciano had played a central role in overseeing a large prostitution operation that generated substantial profits. Defense attorneys challenged the credibility of witnesses and attacked the prosecution's case. The legal battle was intense. Ultimately, the jury reached its decision. Luciano was convicted. He received a sentence of 30 to 50 years in prison. The outcome stunned much of the underworld. For years, major organized crime leaders had often avoided serious punishment through intimidation, corruption, or lack of evidence. Dewey's victory demonstrated that even the most powerful figures could be successfully prosecuted under the right circumstances. The consequences extended far beyond one defendant. The conviction sent a message throughout organized crime networks that prosecutors were becoming more sophisticated and increasingly willing to pursue senior leadership. Yet Luciano's story was not over. He was transferred to state prison and remained incarcerated as the world moved toward another defining historical event: World War II. During the war years, American authorities became concerned about potential security threats involving ports, shipping facilities, and waterfront operations. New York's docks represented critical infrastructure for military logistics. Intelligence agencies worried about sabotage, espionage, and disruptions to wartime transportation. According to documented government investigations and later historical research, officials explored whether organized crime figures could help provide information and influence along the waterfront. One aspect of these efforts became associated with what researchers later called Operation Underworld. The full extent of every participant's role remains debated among historians. However, declassified records and subsequent investigations confirm that government officials communicated with individuals connected to organized crime during the wartime period. Luciano's name repeatedly surfaced in those discussions. Although imprisoned, he retained influence among certain criminal figures. By the end of the war, conversations regarding his future had begun attracting official attention. In 1946, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey approved Luciano's commutation on the condition that he be deported from the United States. The decision remains one of the most discussed episodes in organized crime history. Supporters cited wartime cooperation claims and other considerations. Critics questioned the wisdom of granting relief to a convicted organized crime figure. Regardless of the debate, the result was clear. After years in prison, Luciano was released. But he would not remain in America. Authorities deported him to Italy. The country where he had been born nearly half a century earlier became the place of his exile. For many criminal leaders, removal from the United States would have signaled the end of meaningful influence. Luciano attempted to prove otherwise. Historical accounts place him in Italy shortly after deportation, where authorities closely monitored his activities. Concerns persisted regarding potential connections to international criminal operations. Government officials in both Europe and the United States remained interested in his movements. At one point, Luciano relocated to Cuba. The move alarmed American authorities. His presence in Havana raised fears that he might re-establish direct influence over criminal enterprises operating in the United States. Diplomatic pressure followed. Eventually, Cuban authorities forced him to leave. He returned to Italy. The system he had helped create, however, continued functioning. The commission endured. The five families remained active. Organized crime organizations expanded into new markets and adapted to changing conditions. Many of the structural principles historians associate with Luciano's era survived for decades after his departure. Yet the same framework that improved coordination also created vulnerabilities. As the 20th century progressed, federal law enforcement agencies became increasingly effective. Surveillance technology improved. Witness protection programs encouraged cooperation. Intelligence gathering expanded. Criminal organizations that once relied on secrecy faced growing pressure. Court records from later decades would reveal a recurring pattern. Internal trust weakened. Informants emerged. Former allies testified. The mechanisms designed to preserve power often became sources of exposure. This dynamic reflected a reality long recognized by investigators studying organized crime. Criminal enterprises depend heavily on loyalty, but loyalty becomes difficult to maintain when members face lengthy prison sentences or fear for their lives. The structure could manage disputes. It could generate profits. It could not eliminate human self-interest. Luciano spent his final years living primarily in Naples. Despite his exile, journalists, law enforcement officials, and historians remained fascinated by his role in transforming organized crime. He became a symbol of a pivotal transition from fragmented gang warfare to a more organized national system. On January 26, 1962, Luciano died of a heart attack at Naples International Airport. He was 64 years old. The man who had survived gang wars, prison, political battles, and international scrutiny did not fall to an assassin's bullet. His life ended suddenly while preparing for a meeting connected to a film project about his experiences. The historical legacy he left behind remains controversial. To law enforcement, he was a major architect of organized criminal activity whose influence contributed to decades of racketeering, corruption, and violence. To organized crime historians, he was a transformative figure who reshaped the structure of the American Mafia more profoundly than perhaps any other individual. The murder of Joe Masuria in 1931 did more than remove a rival. It accelerated a revolution within the underworld. Old traditions gave way to new systems. Power became more organized. Criminal enterprises became more efficient. And, for a time, those changes strengthened organized crime across the United States. But history would demonstrate a lesson repeated throughout countless investigations and court cases. No criminal empire remains untouchable forever. Leadership changes. Alliances fracture. Witnesses emerge. Governments adapt. The structures designed to preserve power eventually confront forces they cannot fully control. Lucky Luciano helped build a system intended to outlive any single man. In many ways it did. Yet the records left behind, from court transcripts to law enforcement files and decades of investigative reporting, show that even the most influential figures ultimately become part of the history they once shaped. The system had spoken.